Today on Bonsai-U, we're going to be discussing one of the most difficult subjects in bonsai art, and that is Japanese aesthetics. I thought, what better place to do that than the cultural and artistic capital of Japan, Kyoto City. So here we are at the Imperial Palace in the heart of the city, and we're going to dive into this fascinating and deep subject today. Now, I've said it many times before here on the Bonsai-U platform, but Kyoto is my favorite city anywhere in the world. It really is kind of the origination point of what we consider to be Japanese culture and Japanese aesthetics in the Western world nowadays. So things like tea ceremony, for example, or concepts like wabi-sabi, or even Japanese gardens. This is really the capital of Japanese gardens and all of these aesthetic elements in Japan. So I thought it'd be a perfect place for us to sit down, really dive deep into this subject of Japanese aesthetics, which, like I said before, is very deep, very difficult to discuss, and hopefully I can get this across to you guys in a way that we can relate back to bonsai art. Now, before we dive into this mini documentary today, I recommend that you guys pick up this book right here. This is a tractate on Japanese aesthetics by Donald Ritchie. I've mentioned it on the platform many times before, but I think this is probably the best distillation of Japanese aesthetics in an English format. So you can pick this up on Amazon or many outlets online. It's very short, only about 60 pages long, but it's one of those books that you'll need to go back and read over and over and over again. And a lot of the concepts we're going to be talking about today will come directly from this book. So first and foremost here, we need to define our term aesthetics. Aesthetics is a philosophical study of beauty and taste, but what is beautiful and what is tasteful, and what are the cultural and societal influences that lead to certain outcomes in a given nation in terms of what a people deem as beautiful and tasteful?
This is a question that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. The difficulty lies in the subjectivity of the terms beautiful and ugly, which can be applied to a wide range of objects and experiences. What one person finds beautiful, another might find unattractive. This subjectivity makes it difficult to divide the world into things that are beautiful and things that are not. Some argue that there is a single underlying belief that motivates all of our judgments of beauty. Others claim that beautiful is simply an expression of personal attitude and preference, and that different people attach the term to vastly different things. The debate continues to this day, and as we delve deeper into the complexities of aesthetics, we find that the answer to this question is far from clear.
So what then exactly should we be studying in order to understand these ideas of beauty and taste? Well, let's take a look at three potential approaches to this endeavor.
The study of aesthetics is a fascinating journey into the world of beauty and taste. One of the key elements of this field is the analysis of the language of criticism, where we examine the judgments and reasoning behind different aesthetic concepts. One of the most influential figures in this area was Edmund Burke, who in his treatise on the sublime and beautiful attempted to distinguish between these two key aesthetic concepts and analyze the different human attitudes they evoke. Burke's distinction between the sublime and the beautiful was highly influential and reflected the style of criticism of his time. In recent times, philosophers have focused on modern literary concepts such as representation, expression, form, style, and sentimentality to understand the nature of beauty. The goal of this study is twofold: to evaluate the validity of these concepts and to understand the unique human experiences that they express. Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy that delves into the mind's response to beauty and art. One of the seminal works in this field is The Critique of Judgment by Immanuel Kant, who posits that the key to understanding the aesthetic experience lies in the faculty of judgment. This faculty allows us to separate our scientific and practical concerns from our emotional responses to objects, and to adopt a disinterested attitude towards them. This disinterest is what enables us to experience the aesthetic realm in various ways, and the study of aesthetics is an attempt to understand these responses and emotions. In recent years, philosophers have sought to understand the concept of aesthetic attitude and aesthetic experience in new ways. However, it's important to keep in mind the distinction between philosophy of mind and empirical psychology. Philosophy is not a science, as it does not investigate the causes of phenomena. It is an a priori or conceptual investigation. Its purpose is to identify and understand things rather than to explain them. The two most prominent philosophical methods, phenomenology and conceptual analysis, prioritize this goal over the goal of science. The study of aesthetics also involves the examination of the aesthetic object. This approach suggests that the problems of aesthetics arise mainly because there are certain objects in the world that we react to differently and describe using aesthetic terms. The most common objects considered to be aesthetic objects are works of art. Other objects, such as landscapes, faces, and found objects, are also included in this class because they too can be considered as art. This approach to aesthetics focuses on understanding the characteristics of these objects that make them unique and how they evoke different emotional responses in people. When studying aesthetics, there is a debate about whether to focus on the study of art and its spiritual content, or to study aesthetic objects and experiences more broadly. Some argue that aesthetics should not be limited to the study of art, but should also include the study of other aesthetic objects and experiences, and finding the true characteristics that define the aesthetic realm.
Perhaps it's unnecessary to take one of these approaches when studying aesthetics and instead actually use all three when analyzing a given field of aesthetics. This might lead to a bit of confusion, but it might also lead to a multifaceted, deeper understanding about that specified field of aesthetics. And in this case, we're referring to bonsai art and design. Now that we have a basic understanding of aesthetics in general, let's dive deep into the specific subject of Japanese aesthetics. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a difficult topic to discuss because it spans many centuries and many cultural shifts across those epochs throughout Japanese history. I think perhaps the best place to begin, though, is here in the former capital city of Kyoto, when it was founded in 794 as Heian-kyo.
The Heian period, which lasted from 794 to 1185, was a time of great cultural and artistic flourishing in Japan. It was also a period of political consolidation, as the imperial court in Kyoto became the dominant force in the country. At the beginning of the Heian period, the capital of Japan was moved from Nara to Kyoto. This was a significant event as it marked the start of a new era in Japanese history. The imperial court, which had previously been heavily influenced by Buddhism, began to develop its own unique culture. One of the most notable achievements of the Heian period was the creation of the first written Japanese language. Prior to this, the Japanese had used Chinese characters to write, but during the Heian period, a new writing system called kana was developed. This made it possible for Japanese women who were not educated in Chinese to write literature.
Now, the Heian aristocracy really were the arbiters of taste and beauty and aesthetics in general for that particular period. And you can really see this reflected in the poetry of the time, obviously, but also in works of literature like The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. Now, kind of interesting side note here, Murasaki means purple, so her last name was Purple, and this was a woman who wrote this book. As a matter of fact, this is actually considered the first novel in the world and probably the first novel written by a woman, but her name was Murasaki Shikibu, and Murasaki, meaning purple, has actually been adopted for the name of Japanese beautyberry. So we call Japanese beautyberry in Japan Murasaki Shikibu, named after this woman. course, the berries on Murasaki Shikibu, or beauty berry, are purple. So it's a good combination there. But in any case, back to the story here. So during this period, during the Heian period, the aristocracy really were the ones who kind of dictated what aesthetics were. And a lot of this was dictated by rules of divination and geomancy, essentially kind of superstitious ideas about how to travel through the city, for example, or what types of clothes that you could wear on any given day. Color combinations, fabric combinations, all of these kind of things led to a very specific type of aesthetic for that period. And as it relates to gardening and bonsai, during this particular time as well, there was a book that was written called the Sakuteki, which is a book that sort of dictates how to build a proper Japanese garden based on those rules of divination and geomancy. So, for example, a small river would have to run from the northeast side of the garden through the garden down through the southwest side and exit from that portion of the garden. If it went the opposite direction, it was considered inauspicious and could lead to bad outcomes within the home. So it's quite interesting, that all of these sort of aesthetic principles arose from weird kind of superstitious ideas of the time. Now, the next big cultural shift in Japan happened a few hundred years later in the 1400s when Ashikaga Yoshimasa took over the shogunate during a period known as Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring Epoch. Now, during this period of warring, the entire city of Kyoto was burned down multiple times, and as the military leader of Japan, Ashikaga Yoshimasa became fed up with all of the fighting and warring and decided to retire to a villa on the eastern side of the city known as Ginkaku-ji, or the Silver Pavilion, which of course you can still go visit to this day. Now, while he was there, he essentially became a recluse and dedicated the rest of his life to the pursuit of aesthetics and art, and more specifically, he was very interested in Southern Song period paintings from China, which were characterized by being monochromatic. And quite often these paintings had very little ink on the actual canvas. Essentially, you might see a landscape with a small mountain at the very top of the scroll and maybe a small river represented at the bottom, and almost nothing painted in between. The idea being that the clouds were shrouding the rest of the mountains, and you as a viewer were supposed to make up what wasn't there in your mind. So a lot of what we consider to be kind of modern Japanese aesthetics in terms of simplicity of design, use of kind of a monochromatic palette, really stemmed from this period when Ashikaga Yoshimasa was dedicating his life to that style of art. Now, in terms of how the aesthetic pursuits of Ashikaga Yoshimasa relate to bonsai specifically, there is actually a building at his Ginkaku-ji, or Silver Pavilion, called the Tokudo, which houses Japan's first ever Tokonoma, or alcove. Now, it's a little bit different than the modern interpretation of a Tokonoma, but it was the first alcove where items of aesthetic beauty were actually put on display. And there's actually some records of Ashikaga Yoshimasa judging what was called a Bonsan exhibition, which was kind of like landscape penjing or landscape bonsai at one of the local temples here in Kyoto. So it's not a far stretch to think that perhaps maybe at some point in the Tokudo, in that very first Tokonoma, a Bonsan might have been displayed sometime during the late 1400s or early 1500s. Now, the next cultural shift in Japan happened just a few years later in the 1500s via a man named Sen no Rikyu. Now, Sen no Rikyu might be a familiar name to you as he's very famous as a tea master here in Kyoto. And he was actually the tea master for a couple of different shoguns, Oda Nobunaga to begin with, and then Toyotomi Hideyoshi later. Now, the shogunate at that time had shifted away from the sort of simplistic aesthetic principles that the previous shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, was pursuing at Higashiyama, or the Silver Pavilion on the eastern side of the city. And they moved much more towards kind of an ostentatious aesthetic. So gold, for example, was quite often used during this period. The gardens that were designed during this period as well had very loud, upright stones. And you can really see this represented at Nijo Castle here in Kyoto. Now, Sen no Rikyu sort of set himself up in juxtaposition to that by kind of diving into tea ceremony from the perspective of being ostentatiously simplistic. So he would use things like, for example, rakuware, which is a type of ceramic ware that is very subdued in coloration and very naturalistic, for example. He would also use things like bamboo to create flower holders to display in the Tokonoma during a tea ceremony. So he was using all sorts of natural elements and bringing them into the tea ceremony to sort of separate himself and juxtapose his aesthetic ideals to that of the shogunate at the time.
Simplicity. This was something that Rikyu tried to teach his pupil, Hideyoshi, at whose court he was arbiter. One famous anecdote illustrates this method. Rikyu's Garden of Morning Glories was known for its beauty. Hearing of it, Hideyoshi demanded that he be invited to visit. So he was, but when he arrived, all the morning glories were no more. They had all been scythed. Perturbed, Hideyoshi retired to the nearby tea house, and there, the modest flower arrangement in the alcove was a single morning glory, the only survivor, superb in its focused simplicity. The warlord is supposed to have stared, then nodded, and said that he understood the lesson.
Now, despite Sen no Rikyu's popularity and influence at the time, his life ended rather abruptly when he was asked to commit seppuku, or ritual suicide, by his biggest patron, Toyotomi Hideyoshi.
Among the several unproved charges was that he had made money out of simplicity, that he had demanded exorbitant prices for his tea utensils. It was perhaps not the illegality of this that caused comment, but its vulgarity, the extracting of common profit from an activity presumably free from just such ambitions.
Now, despite the ultimate downfall of Sen no Rikyu, he really did have a lasting impact on Japanese aesthetics and design in the form of this idea of ostentatious simplicity. As a matter of fact, he was the individual who really popularized the idea of wabi-sabi. Now, next up here, I want to dive into some of the Japanese lexicon related to aesthetics, because Japanese language is quite unique in that words, simple words or individual words, can actually have big, broad meanings. And, as a very high context language, Japanese is very unique in relation to, say, English, for example, which is a very low context language. So let's dive into the vocabulary in Japanese as it relates to aesthetics and design and fill out this concepts of understanding beauty and taste.